Hi guys, I'm Zach from the Paradox Institute, and today we will be reacting and responding to the neuroscience section of Forrest Valkai's Sex and Sensibility video. We'll be joined with Sammy, a neuroscience PhD student. Enjoy. For those who don't know, Sammy and I are actually working on a project right now where we will be analyzing the very topic that Forrest Valkai is discussing when it comes to the neuroscience of sex differences, but specifically what's called the brain sex hypothesis. The idea that for trans people or people who have gender dysphoria, the cause of that difference is due to them having an opposite sex brain in their body. And so what we're going to do with Sammy today is go through Forrest Valkai's Sex and Sensibility video, specifically the neuroscience section, and we're going to break it down in detail and provide everyone with a lot more knowledge than Forrest actually provides and clarify what he's talking about, and also discuss many of the studies that he either cited or is using to try and validate his claims. And so we're really excited, and we're happy to have Sammy here with us because he has such a depth of knowledge when it comes to sex differences, especially sex differences in the brain. Just tell us a little bit about your background and what your research studies are, what your plan is in your PhD that you're going to get, and yeah.
So I started off in psychology. That was my undergrad, and that's sort of where I first really learned about sex differences. I remember I had this one lecture where it was one lecture on sex differences in neuroscience. That's all I had in my whole undergrad, and my lecturer asked, "Are there sex differences in the brain?" And his answer was yes-ish, no-ish. And at the time, I was really confused. I was like, well, that makes no sense. So I started to get really interested in it. And I wanted to learn more about the brain. So I did my master's. That was in molecular neuroscience. I wanted to really understand. I was less interested in psychology and how the mind works, but I was more interested in how the brain works. And then down that path, I had two main interests. The first one was obviously sex differences. And the second one was about sleep, circadian rhythms, and all that sort of thing, which is actually really, really interesting. And there's lots of sex differences there as well, right? So that led me on to my PhD that I'm doing now. I'm currently in my second year, and officially I'm doing neuroimmunology. So I'm looking at microglial cells, they're the immune cells of your brain, how they go awry in dementia, specifically Alzheimer's disease, and how this all interlinks with sleep and circadian rhythms. So your immune system is actually contributing to your sleep on a daily basis. And that can go awry in Alzheimer's disease. And like a lack of sleep and circadian dysregulation is like one of the biggest risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So that's what I want to do in the future. So my main academic interest is in sleep and immunology and all that sort of thing within the brain. But if that falls through, I'll probably go into the sex differences data. So
I'm sure that, man, you just probably learned so much already and so much detail in neuroscience that you can even apply to sex differences and just how the brain works and all the different molecular mechanisms in the brain and how neurons work and things like that.
Yeah, it's one of those things where even in cognition, so you see all these average differences, sex differences in cognition. But one of the factors that may be underappreciated is that there is circadian variation in how well you're doing certain cognitive tasks, and there are sex differences in how early or how late men and women go through their circadian rhythms. So if you do a study on cognition and you measure your men at one time and the women at a different time, you may either exaggerate or reduce the size of the difference that you find.
Okay.
So it's one of those things that no one ever thinks about, really.
Yeah.
It's really invalidating.
Yeah.
For a lot of people. Well, if your career in neuroscience falls through for whatever reason, from what I've seen on Twitter, you can make a killing as a male model or something like that.
Oh my gosh.
Now people are telling you that you're super hunky. So, I mean, there's that going for you too.
Saw that lady saying that. That was so funny.
That was only one tweet though, so that's not I wouldn't call myself a model.
That was just the one who had the guts to come forward and tell you how she feels. I'm sure there are just droves of them who aren't, ready to support.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go through Forrest's video. I'll pause it at certain times and we can respond to it. So we're starting at the neuroscience section.
And speaking of understanding, let's take a minute to talk about brains. Now, I don't have time in this video to get into like the whole anatomy and physiology of how brains work, so I'm gonna skip all that, and I'm just gonna say that there are, in fact, small structural differences between the brains of male and female humans. In other animals, these differences are big enough to be seen with the naked eye, but in humans, they're quite subtle. We're talking about clusters of neurons that are like the size of a grain of rice.
Okay, so let's respond to that part. It's true that there is structural differences in the brain between males and females, and that's an average difference. It's, like you said, small to a degree.
Yeah, you see it in like, not just these nuclei that he's going to mention in the video, but you see it in all sorts of places in the brain. But again, like you say, it's on average, it's on the population level. Some of it can correlate with brain size. Some of it can be socialization. Some of it can be due to, hormones through puberty. There's lots of different ways that the brains can vary on average between the sexes, but it's not like all men have the same male part, all females have the same female part. Because if you actually look at all of the studies and you look at the graphs, you'll see loads of variations. You see like loads of, if they plot all the individual participants, you'll see people who are so atypical. But cause it's always on the average.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's not like a single thing that we can call, oh, this is the male brain or this is the female brain, as if it's like a black and white dichotomy that applies to every single individual in the same way. There's a lot of variation and there's a lot of overlap, but it doesn't mean that there are no differences at all.
Yeah. One thing people get confused about is that with machine learning algorithms, you can predict sex with like 95% accuracy looking at brain scans. But people don't realize that's not saying it's a male brain or a female brain, because say if you have 100 traits that could be male typical and 100 traits that could be female typical, you could have a different mixture of 60 that are more male typical, and someone else could have a different mixture of those, a different number of 60, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it's predicting the male brain through different patterns, different combinations of those patterns. So it's not just because you can predict sex with brain scans doesn't mean it's everyone's got the exact same male brain.
So it's just a way of predicting what is the sex that brain belongs to. Like what we're predicting the person's sex based on those traits in the brain. But it doesn't mean that if you have atypical traits for your sex in the brain, that suddenly makes you not male or female or in between or things like that. Yeah.
So, and a lot of that's based on, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
A lot of that's based on brain size as well. So if you control for brain size, that accuracy goes down to like 70%, which is still above chance. But then there's other things that these machine learning algorithms aren't considering. So how I mentioned like circadian stuff. So you've got circadian differences in the brain, but that's not going to be picked up by a machine learning algorithm looking at structural differences, for example, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
So with the brain structure and like brain size, like how different can brain sizes be in people?
So males on average have about 10 to 11% larger brain, again, on average. Mm-hmm. And that can have a lot of downstream effects. So one of the biggest sex differences that's known about is that women tend to have more interhemispheric connectivity. They've got more connections going between the hemispheres, where males have more connections going within each hemisphere. Mm-hmm. And with an increasingly larger brain, you're getting more intrahemispheric connectivity, right? Because the brain's getting too big, so it needs to connect within each hemisphere to perform just as well. Okay. So women with large brains will have more intrahemispheric connectivity, and men with smaller brains will have more interhemispheric connectivity. Yeah. It just works out that men, on average, have slightly larger brains.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, I think, when I read studies in sex differences on verbal and math ability. A lot of people assume that the stereotype is, oh, women aren't very good at math compared to men, but that's not true at all. Actually, what's going on is that because of that interhemispheric connectivity going across the hemispheres, which is more common or more like higher in women, as you mentioned, it's that women actually excel at math and verbal ability compared to men, whereas men just really excel at math ability, and they're not really as great at verbal ability on average. So it's partially, I think, that interhemispheric connection that's really maybe potential evidence for that. So.
Yeah, and one interesting thing as well, like even if you control for height and weight, so if you get men and women of the same height and weight, men will still have a slightly disproportionately larger brain by about 4%. Now, that doesn't mean a bigger brain is a more intelligent brain. That's not what that means at all. It's just how it is, unfortunately.
So it's just kind of by chance that somebody ends up with like a bigger brain or a smaller brain.
And another thing is like, how can I say this? I forgot what I was going to say now.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Okay. What about like brain size, like body size? So there's a correlation, obviously, between brain size and body size, right?
Oh, yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
If you have a study and you control for brain size, so say if you find a sex difference and then you go, we'll control for brain size, because a brain isn't an exact, it doesn't just scale linearly, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, if you actually, because the brain is slightly bigger in males, even for the same height of weight, if you correct for brain size, you actually may end up overcorrecting because you're going past that 4%. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
So you might actually mask or give a female advantage by accident by overcorrecting.
Okay. Huh.
And then one more
a lot
question.
Of people say,
go ahead.
Go on.
No, you go first. I don't want you to
go,
forget.
Sammy.
So a lot of people say like, because that difference didn't survive brain size correction, that it's not there at all. But again, you need more nuance to understand that if you do that, you might actually hinder the results.
Okay.
So, people talk a lot about brains being plastic when it comes to like the architecture and how your environment influences like your brain and thought patterns and things like that. Like abuse victims will have like a different brain architecture than people who didn't go through abuse. Is that different based on sex, or does that have an impact on the sexed brain, like algorithms and things like that in machines?
I know that like on the molecular level, if you're looking at like the hormones, so androgens and estrogens, I know that they may regulate neuroplasticity in a sex-specific way on average, at least in rodents anyway. So even though you're getting the same result, which is like plasticity and these changes, the actual mechanisms and the pathways may be slightly different because androgens and estrogens might regulate different genes for the same process, if that makes sense. So
okay, yeah.
Another thing is like when we talk about sex differences, there's different ways you can view that. So you can have a difference between men and women. You can have a behavioral difference, or you can have like a behavioral difference no behavioral difference. So they perform the same on a task, but they use different parts of the brain to do that.
Okay.
So that's a sex difference, even though they performed equally well on the task.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've read a study about how empathy is one of those examples where they've found evidence that men and women can have similar empathy levels, but they use different parts of the brain to express that trait, or even in certain tasks. And I think that's really, really insightful, that it's not a one-to-one connection between the like structure of the brain and how it is actually utilized in a task. That can be different. So yeah, that's an important thing too. Okay, so we're at where Forrest is talking about how there's small differences between males and females, and
which it sounds like they're pretty significant, even though
and there can very
tiny.
Very significant and important ones actually in the brain that impact males and females on average.
I think that's the other thing that people need to realize is this formula that these activist types like kind of like present is, it's such a small thing, really. Like if you look at it through a microscope or you try to measure it, it's like really small, like the actual amount of
so it doesn't matter
hormones or the size of that part of the brain is really small. But the thing with bodies is that like really small processes, they have like this ripple effect. Like it just,
because bodies exist within an entire system, and all those processes are important.
You think some of these small differences, even though they're small nuclei, they may have many ascending projections to many regions of the brain, and downstream of that, they're going to affect that area, that brain area, and so on. So you actually, even though it's a small difference,
it's like a seed or like a ripple.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Just like how in sex differentiation, where you have the SRY gene, and that causes a cascade of other genes for male development.
Yeah.
Like all those different like snowball effects that happen downstream. Yeah. Okay, we're going to continue. We'll see what he says next.
Oh, fun.
These are differences that develop within a few weeks before birth to maybe a couple of years after birth. The major notable brain regions that are usually talked about in research papers on this type of thing are the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area, the central subdivision of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, and the vasoactive intestinal polypeptide-containing subnucleus of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Yeah, try saying that 3 times fast. And here's a fun fact for you. Trans people have been consistently shown to have neural architecture in these areas that matches their gender identity, not their genitalia.
So that's the big one, that those 3 areas of the brain, the BSTc, the SDN-POA, and the VIP-SCN, that those areas, for some reason, he said, match the sex that they identify as. And this has been an area of research for decades now, and so we can break down each of those areas and talk about that in detail. So you can start us off, Sammy.
Right, so one of the first things he says is that he says gender identity, but he doesn't give any definition of what that is. So he's just sort of arguing with nothing
That's
there, really.
really bigoted of you.
Guilty. So the first one he says is the central subdivision of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. But what you'll notice in this video as well, it doesn't give you any overview of what these nuclei do, if they're corresponding to, if he's talking about like the actual rodent data or human data, because there's lots of, especially the SDN-POA that he mentions, that's hilariously inconsistent in the literature. It's awful. But I'll start with the BSTc. So to give you an idea of what this actually does, in humans, there's been lots of fMRI studies that's revealed that the BST is involved in like fear and anxiety. So some of these studies where if you're in an fMRI scanner and they get people with specific phobia, to say spiders or something, if they wait and they wait and they wait, and that BSTc is going mental, right? It's really active. And then when you actually see the picture that's scary, it becomes deactivated. And the amygdala, which is like a fear response, stress response, all the really potent stress responses that we feel, that becomes activated. And then when the picture goes again, and there's that apprehension, the anxiety, the BSTc then becomes active again. So it's very involved in apprehension, anxiety, and it goes awry in PTSD, general anxiety disorder, all of these sorts of things. So when you think about that, and you look at sex differences as well, you'll find that women, on average, have more anxiety problems, and all these depression and things like that. When it comes to the trans people, the study that he's probably referring to, the finding was actually non-significant. So it didn't even reach statistical significance. It was like p 0.083, which is just nowhere near. But what they found in the original swab studies was that it was independent of homosexuality. So homosexuals had a normal, if you were, for their sex, BSTc. And the male to female transsexuals had a more female-like BSTc. And it's often argued that that's where gender identity is located within the brain. But for me, there's so many different ways you can explain that. So one that I've spoken a lot about on Twitter is that if it is involved in depression and anxiety and all these things, you find that trans women, so that's the male to female transsexuals, have such high rates of depression. And we know that this nucleus can change a lot with environmental input as well. So, the environment could play a big role there. Mm-hmm. And in addition, the same authors that actually identified this nucleus in transgender people later found that this nucleus doesn't even become dimorphic until around 30 to 35 years of age. So this is way, way after the onset of gender dysphoria, especially in like childhood, if you think about that.
Well, I mean, that would, in my opinion, correlate with autogynephilia, because that gets worse with age. Mm-hmm. So there might be some kind of correlation.
Yeah, there's a level of anxiety related to that as well. Yeah. But I think that it is really interesting that there's that correlation between anxiety anxiety disorders and that hyperactive, if I'm not mistaken, the BSTc. And there was also a study done that Forrest cited that was from 2000, and it analyzed 6 male to female transsexuals.
Yeah.
And
that's what I was on. That's the one that was non-significant as well.
Yeah, that was the non-significant. Yeah. And they were on estrogen for like a majority of their time before the study was taking place. And so that is also a confounding variable, is like, how does estrogen impact the BSTc? And we also know that estrogen has a potential role in regulating or affecting anxiety disorders, right? So that could be a potential confounding variable that Forrest doesn't even mention.
Yeah. Like, just in my experience with taking artificial estrogen, it was like, oh my gosh, I wanted to be like crawling on the ceiling at like 4 a.m. Like, the anxiety was through the roof. And then they took me off of it, and then I crashed. So it was really crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would imagine that would have a pretty significant impact.
So it's just unreasonable to claim that the BSTc, that atypical differences in males or in people with gender dysphoria in general is evidence that they actually have an opposite sex brain. Like we discussed, there is not one single thing called an opposite sex brain or a male female brain. There's differences, right? So
one thing that's really interesting as well is that in those studies, to identify the actual borders of the BSTc, that they stained for a peptide called somatostatin, right? And in normal neurons, somatostatin is inhibitory, right? So there's this idea that in a healthy microcircuit, so if these neurons are interneurons, right? So it's like a little local microcircuit, these somatostatin neurons are firing quite high at baseline. So it's inhibiting the nucleus, right? So you've got a high signal to noise ratio. In a pathological circuit, when there's not a lot of somatostatin, which was what was found in those transgender participants, you haven't got that signal to noise ratio. So these neurons aren't firing at baseline. So there's no inhibition. So that nucleus at baseline is just firing constantly. So you can see why that nucleus, can cause anxiety.
Okay, and we know that having gender dysphoria, there's a lot of comorbidities with anxiety disorders, with depression, eating disorders, all these different things that could be, indicators of that happening in the brain.
Even things like OCD.
One thing that's associated with anxiety and depression is actually low somatostatin in the brain. So and there's an extra correlation there with this nucleus and depression, and there's the correlation between depression and anxiety in these individuals as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's something that those studies looking at those transgender individuals did not account for at all. Yeah.
No.
And again, like, going back to an argumentative standpoint, he was talking about how, these parts of the brain, these sex difference parts are so small. Not even worth like looking at.
That's right.
But then now he's going, but look at how important these like lineups are between trans women's brains and women's brains and the opposite sex. It's
if they're so small and that means the variation is so large, why can't you accept that variation as within sex variation within males and within females, right?
So it's a contradiction. Like, why is it important now, but it wasn't important 2 minutes ago?
Absolutely. So, the next one, what do you want to cover next? The SDN-POA or the other one?
We'll do the SDN-POA.
Okay.
So in this nucleus, it's famous in rodents, right? So it stands for the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. And if you zoom out a little bit into the hypothalamus and you just look at the POA, so the preoptic area, that's in itself is quite sexually dimorphic in rodents, and it correlates really strongly with sex-specific reproductive behavior, right? So in males, it causes mounting, thrusting, intermissions, all that fun stuff. In females, it causes lordosis. So that's when the rat will actually have dorsiflexion of the spine and it'll lift its bum in the air. Right? So it's like ready for sex play, basically. And if you zoom in slightly, you get the medial POA, so the MPOA, that's the part that's actually most important. So if you lesion that part of the brain, males will no longer mount thrust. They'll do none of their male-specific acts. If you stimulate that, they'll do more, right? And that's especially true in sexually experienced male rats. But if you go to the next level, so that's the SDN-POA, which is actually the most dimorphic part, that surprisingly, if you lesion that in experienced animals, it doesn't really do much, which is quite odd, a bit paradoxical. If you lesion it in sexually naive male rats, it has a big effect. So there's this. So one important factor is actually the sexual experience of the individual and how this nucleus functions, basically. And it's in rodents again. So he mentioned in the video, it's about, you can see it with the naked eye, and in rodents you can. It's about 3 to 8 times larger, and it has about 2 to 3 times more dendritic spines. So that's the site of synaptic connections, excitatory connections, right? And somehow this circuitry contributes to these sex-specific behaviors.
Okay.
That
So
that circuitry in the rodents pretty well researched. Okay. When it comes to the humans, it's an absolute nightmare because we don't know which nucleus it corresponds to.
Okay. That makes sense.
So in the literature for humans, there's been a few. They call it the interstitial nuclei of the anterior hypothalamus, and there's 4 of those nuclei. So it's ANAH 1 to 4, right? Some researchers find sex differences in the first one. Some are found in the third one, and it's really inconsistent because it changes based on age, the type of method they use to assess it, and there's lots of disagreement about which one it corresponds to in the rodent, right?
Right.
So in his video, he's being very confident that this nucleus in our brain, which he thinks is the SDN-POA, which actually there's no consensus on that whatsoever.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. Like, because of that inconsistency in literature, it's not right for him to be making huge claims that, one, we know where that area is exactly for humans and what controls it exactly in humans, what controls that type of sexual behavior. And then also jumping to the even further conclusion of, if there's any differences there, then that's evidence that you're actually trans, or that your identity as trying to identify as the opposite sex is somehow validated by that difference. There's just not any evidence really for you to be making those claims at all.
And this is, I think, where we see, again, like the taxonomy issue come into that type of argument, is like he's conflating something from mice in people. And he's not saying it like outright, but it seems to be what is happening, because that would be where the studies would be coming from, is from the mice, from not from the people. So again, it's important to be clear in where you got your research from and the taxonomy of like which animal it came from.
And there's certain things that do apply from other animals to humans. But there's plenty of things that don't. And for him to conflate those two is not good. It's not teaching people what the actual reality is. And like you said, using the SDN-POA in that area in mice to then apply that to humans when there's not consistent literature in humans, it just doesn't work.
This would be like trying to argue for like, oh, because webbing can increase between digits. Studies have shown that can happen, so you're more adaptable for like aquatic life. Like that would come from studies of like an animal, but then applying it to a human without like any research that consistently backs that up.
One issue I've noticed as well is that when you try and relate these nuclei in the brain to humans, and particularly transgender, you have to remember that if you are going to correspond this to the rodent data is showing you sexual behavior. And if you reverse it, so like if you pump a female pup with estrogen, it then becomes more male-like in the brain. So its SDN-POA becomes more masculine.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then
Huh.
and they'll have less lordosis. They'll start doing male typical behaviors, and it's the same with the male ones, right? So
Right.
what you're changing is the sex behavior,
Right.
not this,
Not the sex.
this like, yeah,
Yeah.
or this dissatisfaction with their natal sex. I don't think rodents
Okay.
think like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So would it be because I think you may have flubbed it because you said a female rodent full of estrogen, then she becomes more male in behavior. Is it
Yeah, no, that's
estrogen?
right.
Really?
Yeah, so what happens is during the sort of embryonic period,
Mm-hmm.
the gonads will produce loads of androgens, so testosterone. That'll go into the brain, and then it will be converted into estrogen via an enzyme called aromatase.
Yeah.
And it's the high levels of estrogen in that period, that perinatal period, that masculinizes the brain. So females don't have that. So their brain goes through the normal female development.
Interesting. Huh.
Interesting.
Yeah. I remember reading information about how estrogen has a role in masculinization, but it was never really made clear to me how that works in the
Yeah.
brain. It's really interesting. It's kind of paradoxical because people,
Yeah.
assume, a lot of people assume that estrogen only has an effect in females or testosterone only effect in males, but obviously both sexes have both hormones. We have both hormones, but to differing levels, and they have different roles.
Yeah.
But that's a really interesting role of estrogen
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to
It's
males'
like
brains.
the estrogen
think
effect on
humans-
height too.
I think in humans, it's not exactly clear if the same sort of mechanism does happen, because our androgen receptor works fine.
Yeah.
So androgens can either go straight to the androgen receptor, or they might be put forth into estrogens and then act via the two estrogen receptors.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So see, can't be used in mice. As
Yeah,
like-
not always. Not for everything.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. So we covered the SDN-POA. We talked about how the literature is not consistent to like what actual structure applies to humans, and there's all those different confounding variables that have not been separated out yet. And now we can move on to the VIP-SCN and how that applies to.
Yeah, so I think this is where he probably got the most confused, because I couldn't find anything on gender dysphoria and that part of the SDN, right? Because the SDN has two parts. It has a core and has a shell. The core part is the VIP bit, right? So it's all that vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. That receives information about the light-dark cycle. It's involved in circadian rhythms and sleep, okay? And what VIP does in the SDN is it synchronizes neurons in the SDN, and it allows for the SDN to output that through its shell, which is vasopressin. So the shell part contains lots of vasopressin neurons. And I think it's vasopressin that he's trying to talk about, because there is absolutely no data on the VIP-SCN.
Yeah, I did research on that too, and I could not find anything that he was talking about on the VIP-SCN.
But even then, the only data I've seen, because there are sex differences in the VIP-SCN, you find like men tend to have slightly more VIP expressing neurons in the SCN. But when it came to homosexuals and sexual orientation, I did find that the VIP-SCN was the same, but homosexual males actually had even more vasopressin SCN neurons than heterosexual males. So rather than being atypical, they actually went the other way, which is what he'll say in a minute, actually, but he gets it confused with the VIP-SCN.
Okay, let's continue this now and let's see what else he says.
So for example, the BSTc is about 50% larger in men than it is in women. A trans man, so someone transitioning from female to male, has a BSTc that is the size of a cis man's. And similarly, a trans woman has a BSTc that is the size of a cis woman's.
What is he defining as a trans man and a trans woman? Is he talking about someone who's already on hormones? Or is he talking about just someone with gender dysphoria who is identifying as trans?
It's
That is
unclear.
not-
He doesn't
He
know.
never says.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because,
But
go ahead.
the studies that he's talking about, it's like Zach said earlier, they're a mixture of like sort of pre and post, because like half of them are on hormone therapy, some of them aren't, some of them are gay, some of them aren't. So it's like really confusing to sort of pinpoint what's actually going on.
Yeah, because when you were talking about the sexual activity part and things like that in the mice, like it reminded me of the phantom phallus things that I've experienced and that other females with gender dysphoria have talked to me about, and like also like AAP and AGP and that kind of thing, and just things like that, like sexually, that I've heard talking to other people with gender dysphoria. So I have to wonder if maybe that might be like what's affecting it. I mean, obviously, like you said, there's not a great way to tell right now consistently, like in humans. But I mean, it'd be interesting to know.
Yeah. There's just not enough studies
Yeah.
on it. And there's so many confounding variables.
Right. And it's not consistent within people with gender dysphoria that I have talked to. Not everybody has those experiences. So even like female attracted, like females who have gender dysphoria, like don't experience the phantom phallus thing or like the urge to thrust or anything like that. And likewise with males that have gender dysphoria. Like, so like AAP in particular is a pretty small like sample like or population size of like people with gender dysphoria, at least from what I've
so it's hard to get data
things like
on
that.
that. But also what he said there with the size difference between the BSTc in trans men versus how it aligns with cis men. Like you said, there are not enough studies to show whether like what that is from, and they're confounded by sexual orientation.
And he could be talking about
that's a huge problem.
He might be.
Yeah, like all those variables that are not being covered, that's a huge problem. And so you can't make, even though let's say that exists, even if that difference exists in the brain, doesn't mean that means that they actually are the sex they identify as.
Right. Well, because it's
another big issue as well.
Oh,
sorry. Another big issue in these is that when these authors are actually trying to actually measure the size of these nuclei, they're doing it by hand. So they stain it for a specific molecule, so like say somatostatin, and they'll draw it around it, and they basically do it that way, which is obviously from person to person doing that. There's going to be a lot of variation as well. And if you consider the other peptides in the BSTc, so I've got some written down here. You've got dynorphin, enkephalin, neurotensin, neuropeptide Y, vasopressin, substance P, neurokinin B. There's all these molecules that are actually in that nucleus, which could show you differential results. They've just stuck to one molecule, and they've sort of hand drawn it basically, and that's one of the biggest issues across these early studies.
So they're drawing their conclusions based on just basically like tagging one molecule, but not the rest of them. So they're missing a lot of data.
Yeah.
So it'd be quite interesting to see how all those other molecules fare in the transgender population. Because it would actually be more interesting if it was only somatostatin that was reduced, because again, that correlates with depression and anxiety. That would be interesting to see.
Yeah, it just doesn't sound like we are, or that we've been precise enough in studying these things.
Yeah, no, we don't have enough like sample size. We're not precise enough. We're doing a lot of confounding variables, like not accounting for confounding variables in our studies. And that's a big problem when it comes to this research.
There's so many potentially confounding variables.
Especially when it comes to the brain.
Yeah. So, and
most of these papers were like 20 years ago as well.
Yeah.
Like they're in the 1990s and early 2000s, and it just sort of stopped. And you can't really find anything on these nuclei post like 2002. It's a bit odd.
That's weird.
Yeah.
That's so weird. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to continue this and we'll see what else he says.
These are structural differences that cannot be accounted for with any amount of sexual reassignment surgery or any amount of hormone therapy. This is literally having a female brain trapped inside a male body or vice versa from birth.
From birth. That's a big one because, like you said, some of these differences don't even exist until like
35 years of age.
35 years of age.
He said it. He even said from like they can happen at birth or a certain amount of time after birth. So he's now like
he's now saying that it all happens at birth.
Yeah,
this is from birth that they're born with it.
Again, he's making it sound so significant now when just a little bit ago, so tiny, smaller than a grain of rice. Don't even worry about it. Don't sweat it. It's not a big deal. Like whatever. Yeah. Like it's weird.
Yeah. What do you think, Sammy?
Yeah, it just blows my mind, really, mate.
Yeah. Like the
Just
female
like-
brain in a male body comment that he made there. Like,
Yeah,
how
I know,
can
yeah.
how can you say that when you just said the differences are so small between
Yeah.
males and females?
But he's saying the entire brain now is and like for me, because I didn't transition, so I'm like, no, tell me more. Like, it's super super accurate and interesting what you're saying, and definitely 100% of the time the case. Like, I've had this argument with activists before where it's like, okay, well, I didn't transition and there are detransitioners. So how do you explain our situation? And they will come back with, oh, well, you're free not to transition. It doesn't work out for everybody. So, and it's like, well, if it is absolute that it is the wrong brain and the wrong body, like, then it has to be like an absolute provable thing. That's what you're proposing right now. So you can't say, oh, it's your choice, it's how you want to identify, whatever, and then say that you are trapped in your body. That poor brain of yours is just with little bars and looking out those eyeballs of yours like, oh, I just wish I could be. Like, no, it's not this. It's, yeah.
I think that's what I've worded from out there, saying the word trap. So these studies
Yeah.
are cross-sectional in design. So they're comparing different groups of people rather than doing it in a longitudinal fashion. So not following the same people over time.
Right.
And considering that these nuclei most likely change with age or other circumstances, it'd be really interesting to have an actual longitudinal sample of transgender people.
Yeah.
But obviously, because this is post-mortem, though, it's going to be very hard to do.
Yeah.
Well, and it would be hard to do anyway because, like, your identity or like how you feel about gender or the social constructs that we stereotype and force on people and whatever, like that changes over time. Like my sister, she also really, really rejected femininity, like because of my grandmother forcing femininity on us. And then now she loves like just everything girly. Like, oh my gosh, I cannot tell you how many like shoes and jewelry and like, like stereotypically feminine things that she's indulged in now, and she really enjoys it. So I don't know that that would yield the results that they are hoping that it would yield. And like, again, and as people get older, like, you just kind of chill out and relax and want to just be comfy. So I don't know how that would factor into like a gender identity because you stop caring. You stop having to, you're not advertising for the opposite sex anymore or for the same sex. You're not advertising for a partner anymore typically at that point. So you're just kind of like chilling in your sweatpants most of the time.
I like your point too that like he is trying to come up with a way to measure gender identity, and he's claiming that this is a way to measure it, and that it proves that they actually are the sex they identify as. But
he hasn't even defined gender identity anyway.
No, he hasn't even defined it. Like, so how can you actually measure it if it hasn't been defined, right?
He's trying to argue for a measurement standard whilst also undermining that the fact that there are differences.
Yes, he's trying to minimize the categorical differences, and then saying that there are categorical differences, right? That is a huge problem. It's a huge contradiction in what he's saying.
Yeah, but I mean, he's just so confident. That's the thing.
The confidence can really trick people a lot. They'll believe it if somebody's really confident about it.
You just posted something about that too, like a chart or something that showed like the confidence
of Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah. The less you know, the more confident you are.
Well, I mean, he's proven it right now.
Yep, absolutely.
So.
I don't know if you guys noticed as well, in a part of what he said a minute ago, he mentioned that no amount of sex reassignment surgery, no amount of hormones will change these nuclei. And I find that a bit of a strange one, because I have seen evidence that, I can't remember what it was now, was it in female to male transsexuals, I think, and they were on androgen treatment. And we noticed that there was lots of plastic changes within the hypothalamus, which is near where these nuclei are located.
Yeah.
So already, these hormones are going to be changing these brain regions.
Yeah, so that's a huge thing to claim.
Yeah.
That they cannot change at all, no matter what you do. Like, as we've shown, they're plastic regions. They can change.
I mean, look at how much it changes the body. So you have to
Yeah.
also realize that it changes the brain.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
That's absolutely insane claim.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay, let's
great. There's
continue.
more.
Yep.
Incidentally, in homosexuals, that same region, the BSTc, is the perfect size for their gender, because sexual orientation and gender are two entirely different things. However, interestingly enough, the VIP-SCN is actually more dimorphic. So it's smaller in females and larger in males, but in gay males, it's even larger. So it's like they're more masculine in this way. So that's kind of cool.
So that's what you mentioned earlier about the about vasopressin, correct? That
Vasopressin, yeah.
yeah, okay. Yep. So, but he's conflating that with the VIP-SCN. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, look at his face too. He just
Yes.
looks so cheerful.
He's so happy. Oh man. So what do you think about that? About what he claimed there? I mean, we kind of already covered a lot of that, but yeah.
Yeah, I forgot what was the first part that he said? I can't remember what he said there.
Let's see. Let me replay that.
Incidentally, in homosexuals, that same region, the BSTc, is the perfect size for their gender, because sexual orientation and gender are two entirely different things.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do know in those studies, homosexual men did have the male typical BSTc for whatever reason. But his thinking behind that is that that gender identity is completely different. Again, something he's not defined.
Yeah.
It's a magical thing that people seem to have.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Well, I mean, it could just be that homosexuals who are comfortable being homosexuals don't have a bunch of like issues with anxiety and depression. Like,
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
yeah. So,
He also, you know how he's claiming that he said right here that sexual orientation and gender identity are completely different things. First of all, he hasn't defined it.
yeah.
But second of all, his studies that he uses to claim that trans people are the sex they identify as, those studies do not account for sexual orientation. Yeah, it's a confounding variable in those studies, where if you look at studies that do account for sexual orientation, those differences go away because now they see that, oh, trans people who are homosexual have brain structures that are typical of other homosexual people. And then trans people who are heterosexual have brain structures typical of regular heterosexual people. So those are studies that do account for sexuality, and they show that actually there is no proof of opposite sex brain.
One interesting point as well is that in the literature on the SDN-POA, or technically in humans, the INAH3, right? Simon LeVay had a famous study where he found it was reversed in homosexuals, right? So there's obviously one confounding variable, but even within that, another study failed to replicate the homosexual finding. So even then, even though you got a possible confounding variable, it's even inconsistent within that as well. So we have no idea what's going on really.
Wow. Yeah, so you can't make any wide sweeping conclusion at all, really.
Yeah.
It's not really possible. Yeah. And to do so is to place yourself on a very, very precarious foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a little silly to me that these people are making these incredible, like, firm statements, like definitive statements about gender identity and being trans and this and that. And they don't have the data at all to back it up. But then also, you are who you say you are. Anyone can be trans. Trans can be anything. And your identity can be anything. So then why bother with this?
Yeah.
Isn't that transphobic?
Right, because you're setting up
Like-
a categorical standard or
Yeah.
measurement that boxes people in, that you have to be or have to have these brain structures to actually be
Right.
trans. And that goes against the entire ideology.
Right. So I don't understand why he's even doing this if there's like no point from an activist perspective to do it.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to say you are who you say you are, you don't need to have gender dysphoria to be trans. Anybody can be trans. Trans doesn't have a definition really. It's just you don't feel comfortable as your birth sex or whatever, and you just want to identify differently. So why? Like that, just say that then. Like there's no point in making like completely false statements if you're gonna do that.
Yeah.
So
You made a really good point there about gender dysphoria and trans being sort of like separate things, because like in all of the data I've seen on transgender brains, they've all got a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, right, via either the DSM-5 or whatever previous version was. So if these activists try and extrapolate that and they say, oh, well, I'm trans, and they're not actually got gender dysphoria, they're just saying I'm trans, it's trendy or whatever it is.
Yeah.
They use this evidence to back up why they're trans, even though they say I haven't got dysphoria. And it's like, well, you can't differentiate between the two, because these studies are on specifically gender dysphoria via a specific criteria. It's very specific.
Right. And people who identify as trans don't necessarily have gender dysphoria, because it's just an identity label for these people.
Like, tell me how these studies refer to somebody who uses like Zer or Fey Fair pronouns or they them. Like, it's not the same as someone who was diagnosed with gender dysphoria and was a transsexual for a set amount of years before having
I think that really takes away from I think that really takes away from people who have dysphoria, because you're just sort of like ruining it for those people who need the help, basically.
No, the therapy options are absurd. No.
Then the argument could be, well, we shouldn't study this because it doesn't actually matter, and because we don't want to create a category, basically, because gender dysphoria, they say, is not a mental condition, not a mental health condition. So we shouldn't actually try to look for regions in the brain that might be causing it or symptoms of it, and so we just shouldn't study that in the brain. And that means that treatment for gender dysphoria could reduce. Treatment options could reduce, which we see now actually happening.
Yeah, and also he's not, at least from what I've seen, not made space for people who have pronouns other than like the sex-based pronouns.
Yeah, he's been
so
working within the binary.
Transphobic turf, Forrest.
Yeah, he's been working within the binary.
One thing I'm quite surprised that he does is that he actually focuses on these three nuclei when, if you know anything about neuroscience in this area, you know how inconsistent this sort of stuff is.
Yeah.
I'm surprised he hasn't tried to cite the actual neuroimaging data, so like the fMRIs, MRIs, because that's what is probably, if you don't know that sexuality is a confounding variable, they're the ones that are probably more convincing. If you didn't know that sexuality was confounding those results.
Yeah, that's true.
And they're probably easier to read because they're a bit more consistent.
Yeah, that's true. But he doesn't know the literature well enough to like understand even how to make the strongest case for his argument.
But you'd think that he would use them because they come with pictures, and I'm sure he would love to just use pictures.
Yes. I don't think he used one picture, which is that brain picture showing the different parts that we discussed.
Yeah. Very specific,
Yeah. With the arrows, the giant arrows coming in. Yeah.
It's tiny nuclei, but the size of the brain of
exactly.
Yes.
Okay, let's see if he says anything else here.
And speaking of homosexuality, there's clear evidence that there's a big genetic component to that as well. Back in the 1990s, there were several studies that were done that showed that if one identical twin was gay, there was up to a 65% chance that the other identical twin would be gay.
Okay, so this is like near the end of the neuroscience section, but we could cover this part right here as well. And I have seen those studies that show that there is a birth order effect, seems like, on homosexuality. I don't know if you have any information to add when it comes to the brain and homosexuality.
Probably two things. So those twin studies are actually like pretty good, I think. I really like twin studies on homosexuality. It shows it doesn't mean there's a gay gene, but it means that like genetics is involved in some way, whatever it is. The problem is, knowing that, I've seen so many twin studies on gender dysphoria trying to find a genetic linkage. But again, you find that all the participants are homosexual. So if you know that sexuality has a genetic component and your gender dysphoric participants are all homosexual, you're going to find the same thing. And going back to that fraternal birth order effect, the same thing's been done as well. So that they did a study on gender dysphoria to see if they got a fraternal birth order effect for that as well. But if you probably guess where I'm going with this, all the participants were homosexual. And in the introduction, they cited all the evidence about this sexual orientation, the fraternal birth order effect, and then they just used the homosexual sample again.
Oh my gosh.
So it's like
control for sexual orientation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, it would make sense in me and my siblings.
Yeah.
Because I'm bisexual, leaning more towards female attraction, and then they're straight, mostly.
Yeah.
Jennifer.
Bisexual.
Yes, Jennifer's bisexual, but she's only just now exploring that.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, but she doesn't have gender dysphoria. She does have an eating disorder, but not the gender dysphoria.
So yeah, that is interesting. Again, like going back to the importance of accounting for all the variables in your studies before making huge claims, accounting for sexual orientation, which is a big one.
Which you would think he would want to do, because he was like, they are not the same thing at all. And it's like,
but he's conflating the two unknowingly by not accounting for the confounding variables. So
it's just so common in the neuroimaging data. It's just unbelievable. Like, I did a tweet thread yesterday where they did a machine learning algorithm on male and females, looked at their brains, and then they had transgender women as well. And they classified this brain sex index where women were 0, men were 1. So the closer you are to 1 more male your brain is, basically.
It sounds pretty binary.
And the transgender women, their index was 0.75. So it was only marginally shifted. It was still like 25% shifted, but it was still mainly male.
Right.
And 25% of that cohort was homosexual.
Oh, wow.
So like that 25% caused that 25% margin
shift. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
But that paper's cited absolutely everywhere all the time.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And I even emailed the authors as well of that study, and they agreed that sexual orientation was the, was what caused it.
Wow.
Like,
that's cool. They got back to you.
Yeah.
I wonder if Forrest emailed anybody.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the pattern that you and I have seen, especially Sammy, when we've done like this research on these papers, is that the papers that include homosexual samples without really accounting for it, they get those results that seem shifted, but in reality, they're not. When those studies that do account for sexual orientation are done, they find that then you can actually separate out the data and see, oh, this is a homosexual effect on this trait. It's not a trans effect on that trait, or not a gender dysphoria effect.
Yeah, and you always see across all these studies where if you actually add up the percentage of homosexuals, so whether it's, say, 100% heterosexual, 25% homosexual, 75% homosexual, and 100% homosexual, you find if you look at those studies that they become more and more atypical. As the percentage of homosexuality increases.
Because of homosexuality. Yeah. Huh.
Well, I mean, kudos for all those studies showing that homosexuality is like a real thing. Yeah. And that it can be measured.
Yeah, it can be measured.
So yay. Because I've had arguments with activists where they were talking about how homosexuality cannot be measured and cannot be shown in any consistent way. And it's like, this is
but they always get confused, because I always say, like, it was confounded by sexual orientation, and they go, oh, we just don't understand because gender identity and sexual orientation are two different things. I'm like, you don't understand.
Yeah, exactly. I've had comments where people are like, you're saying that all trans people are gay? They're not the same thing. It's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that trans people who are homosexual have brains that are more similar to regular homosexuals, and trans people who are heterosexual have brains that are more similar to regular heterosexuals.
Yeah.
And that the differences that we actually find that are unique to people with gender dysphoria have to do with the brain regions moderating or regulating self-perception, the default mode network, for example.
Yeah, so again, it's still early days though, and there's lots of different phenotypes for gender dysphoria, so it's sort of unclear how these, body perception circuits are actually interacting with the different phenotypes as well. But it's still early days, but it does look, well, to me, it looks like, it makes sense as well, because if you look at the crux of what gender dysphoria is, it's this, dissatisfaction with your natal sex.
Yeah.
So I don't get why being atypical, when there's so much variation in atypicalness, should we say, would cause that. So these changes in the brain in the default mode network these white matter tracts like the inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus that connects the default mode network as well. And these are all involved in body perception, self-image, autobiographical memory, thoughts about the self, all of this sort of thing. And these sort of don't get connected very well in their brain. So it's easy to see why that would cause a lot of trauma for these people.
Yeah.
For some reason, activists, they do not want this explanation, or they do not want a different explanation. It has to be, my brain is female. And it's just like...
Right. And it's really, and some people have gotten upset with me for saying this, but it's really not that different from an eating disorder or body integrity disorder, which people are trying to now make body integrity disorder valid. And it was a similar thing. I felt like my genitals were an alien on my body. I was terrified of them. I was disgusted by them. I did not project that onto other females' bodies. So if I looked at another woman, like my mother or my grandmother, if they were like bathing me or something as a child, it didn't disgust me in the way that my body did. And it felt alien to me. And that's how it has continued to present over time, even though I've gotten better with it through therapy and things like that. But so why is that something that they want to validate? Like, why? I just don't understand why that's good or healthy. Like, it's not okay to completely reject and hate parts of your body. Like, that seems very disturbed to me from like, even from like a survival, like a basic animal survival standpoint. Like, that's not normal or natural or yay, glitter family, let's give you a parade. Like, that's, that's like a big deal to want to change those fundamental things about yourself and to be so bothered by them.
Yeah.
So I don't understand. It's the same as thinking your arm is an alien and wanting to cut it off, or your leg or whatever. It's the same thing. It's a
distorted and disordered way of thinking.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that your feelings should not be listened to. They should be listened to, but it doesn't mean that they're true.
Right.
And that's an important distinction. People want to focus on how any feeling or thought you have is absolutely true, and that we shouldn't critically analyze it, right?
We should want us to feel comfortable in our natural bodies without having to rely on that escapism through medicalization or identifying differently. Like, that's not better. That's not good. That's not healthy. That can be a very unhealthy coping mechanism because it becomes harder and harder to find a stopping point for a lot of people, because it does get obsessive, because it's not, you're never going to escape. You're never going to escape your body. Like, until we get like robot bodies and we can transport our consciousness or whatever, like in a sci-fi movie, you can't escape it. Like, that's your body. And I mean, it's natural and good and healthy to love it and accept it and, not try to cut it up and put all kinds of things in there that might not be the best thing for it. So I don't know. It doesn't seem controversial or hateful for me to say that.
Yeah. No, it's not.
So
it's not. It's just the truth. And the truth, you have to balance compassion and the truth. Like, compassion is about like wanting to help others, but to do that, you have to provide the truth and reality. You can't help others if you're denying reality.
Right. So I don't know.
These like detransitioners, like Chloe Cole.
Yes.
On Twitter, so she always says on Twitter that she was told that she had a male brain by doctors and stuff as well.
Yeah.
So like, it's even getting into the sort of medical profession. It's being pushed almost. Yeah.
Well, a friend of ours has Klinefelters and was being told by his doctor that he
did not need testosterone therapy. He just needed to accept his gender identity as a male with a chromosomal disorder.
And it's like, that's really not good for his health. And what are you doing? That's not your place to put into someone's head. Like, that is so, I don't know. It's become very toxic and corrosive.
Yeah. They probably think anyone asking for like that they need hormone therapy is wanting cross-sex hormones or is trans.
He was talking about how there had been a shortage of testosterone that was affecting him. So
gender dysphoria is the only condition or just a behavioral state, whatever, that's affirmed by therapists.
Yeah.
You just don't see it anywhere else.
No.
I just don't get why. Well, I know why, because of the backlash and the activists and stuff, but it's just
yeah.
Especially when you consider like the majority of these gender dysphoric children, at least, grow out of it, and then like they're actually homosexual.
Yeah.
So they don't need to transition.
No,
If you want to do it in adulthood, that's fine by me. You do you. But when it becomes like when you're sort of young, you don't know what you're doing, and
right.
It's being pushed almost.
It's easy to when you're a kid, like when you're a child, your immediate adults are like your guides and your example for how the world works. So if these people are coming into your life and telling you, well, if you feel this way, or you think that man means this and woman means this, then that means you're this thing. Like, it's going to plant those seeds that are going to follow you throughout your development. It's going to color how you see the world and things like that, and how you perceive your experiences. So like, I forever thought growing up that there was something really, really, really wrong with me. I mean, there obviously was with the gender dysphoria, but I mean, I thought there was something wrong with me as a person because I was not able to really make friends with other females. I only got along with males. I liked, boy things like tools and cars and playing rough and that kind of thing. And no, like I was just kind of like an atypical like tomboy, and I was fine. It didn't mean anything, but because I had people telling me that it meant something, it stuck with me. And then it was super distressing around puberty, because that's when a lot of those like social shifts start to happen. Like suddenly boys don't want to hang out with you because they want to be with their peer group and start seeing girls as, like partners, like potential partners and things like that. And girls still didn't like me. But like, and so it was just really kind of an outlier. And then like I had my friends that were boys that still hung out with me tell me that any boy who dated me was gay, because like, oh, you're just so much like a guy, you're one of the guys, so they have to be gay if they date you. So yeah, it was really not great. Growing up. It didn't help. It made things a lot worse. So, of course, like transition comes up as like the magic solution. Finally, you'll fit in. Finally, like you'll feel like yourself. And no, no, like you'll figure it out. You'll get there. You'll find your people. Like,
I suppose you two saw that paper that came out a couple of months ago about they called it like what they call it, social storm or something, about getting gender affirming therapy, where they want it so much is the environment that they're in that might actually improve their mental health rather than the actual therapy, because they got what they wanted in the end, rather than like the treatment did something to their brain and fixed them or whatever it was.
Like
okay, I haven't seen that study. I'll have to look that up.
I'll try and find it. I put it on Twitter a couple of months ago, but I'll try and find it, send it to you.
Yeah, it is. It's like environment plays a huge role, and like just getting healthy psychologically plays a huge role. Like just feeling comfortable and pulling away from people who were enforcing stereotypes and all of that just kind of really helped settle me out. And then of course, like processing all of the trauma and everything. That was great. What a relief.
Absolutely. Huge relief. Like once you go through real therapy and you accept the feelings you're having, but also recognize that they're not necessarily true. There's a more healthy way to live and go about it and be at peace with yourself. Once you go through that, you're just at a much better mental state. And it doesn't mean that like transition is the only way. There's plenty of other actual therapies out there that are really healthy that help you align yourself with your body and accept yourself for who you are.
And that's true for even when people have transitioned. Like I've seen some of my trans friends go from basically the beginning to a point where they just became really obsessive and toxic, and their mental state just tanked because it was never enough, and they never did the therapy, they never processed anything, and it just got worse and worse and worse, and then just ghosted me. I have no idea what happened to them. So there's been people like that in my life. There's been other trans friends that I've had that they've had to go off hormones for like a health reason and started panicking because they thought they were, oh, well, now I'm going to go back to looking and feeling how I was before, and that's horrible. And it's not a great place to be. It sets you up to be very vulnerable. So even if you do transition, like just therapy and pulling yourself into a point where you can be like, okay, I'm comfortable here, no matter what the outcome is, as long as, you know, I'm okay psychologically, that's the best thing.
Yeah, I
A
agree.
lot of them as well. These therapies are sort of advertised as like, you know, if you do this therapy, it's going to be nothing but good for you. And these negative side effects are not well known. I did a little research a while ago. I might get this wrong, but it's a long time ago. But I noticed that in transsexuals on hormone therapy, they had a reduction of blood levels in a molecule called BDNF, which is quite famous in neuroscience, right? So it stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's very important in depression. So when it's high, your depression is pretty much like low. But when BDNF is low, it increases your risk for depression. So if you're going through these therapies and your blood levels of BDNF are going down, you're actually increasing your risk for depression.
Wow.
Okay.
That's really good to know.
Yeah.
I did not know that before.
No, I did know that HRT in females can increase like red cell count and things like that. So they advocate for you to like donate blood and things like that a little more to help with that if it gets to be too high. But
right. So you're saying that was an effect of the cross-sex hormones on what? Or
I
what
think so. Yeah. I can't remember which way around it was. I just know it was hormone therapy, but I can't remember which sort of cohort it was because it was a while ago I read this, but it's on my pinned thread on my Twitter profile. I'm sure I've done a thread about it somewhere. I'll try and find it for you. But
well,
that's really interesting.
Let's wrap this up. So let's summarize what we basically talked about. In Forrest Valkai's Sex and Sensibility video, he talks about 3 brain regions that are supposedly evidence for people being trapped in an opposite sex body, or
even
their
though
brain
they're really
being
small
trapped.
and insignificant.
Even though he says they're very small and insignificant. And so those different brain regions, there are differences in the brain between males and females in those regions specifically, but they're either on average, they're either very small, they're either not, the findings are not consistent, so we can't making broad sweeping conclusions on what that means. And then second, and then third of all, actually, we also don't have enough evidence to show that a person's gender identity actually is the sex they identify as, like that they actually are the sex they identify as, because there's all these confounding variables with sexual orientation and gender identity, gender dysphoria, all these different variables that are either not defined by Forrest or they're confounded. So,
and he absolutely left no room for non-binary or any of the other neo-pronoun gender
he's still
identities
working within that binary framework.
So
male and female.
I want to see the SDN-POA of Aziza. That's what I want to see.
Yeah. Do you have any like final things to mention or summarize with that stuff?
One thing I actually want to do, I actually want to praise him a little bit, because when I did my debunking thread on Twitter, he actually responded, and he was very happy about it. And he was like, you know, he said, I'm a better researcher now than he was when he did the video. It was nothing but happy. So, and he did say he'll take some of these on board and do another video updated, which I would love to see. So I'd love to thank Forrest for that. That was actually really good of him. So.
Yeah,
I'm glad he responded, and I'm glad he like engaged with you. I was honestly really surprised that he did that, and he even showed you the studies that he used, and that gave us the ability to analyze the data in detail and respond to it. And we look forward to seeing his new video that he'll potentially create this year. So yeah.
You know what it is? It's because he's from Oklahoma. That's why he's so.
Yeah, he's from Oklahoma like me. So he's from Tulsa. I'm from Oklahoma City. That was a really interesting anecdote, but it's funny.
And you're wearing a similar color shirt right now, actually.
Well, you're brothers. Related.
Long lost brothers. Finally united through biology.
Yeah, let's do that twin study.
One believes in the sex spectrum, one believes in the sex binary.
Yeah.
But yeah, so people can find you, Sammy, at NeuroSGS on Twitter. and they can look at your pinned tweet, I think, which shows a lot of your threads on neuroscience and sex differences and sexual orientation and gender identity and all those great resources. So thanks for joining us. This has been awesome.
No worries.
And
I've loved it. Yeah.
I'm glad we took the time to respond to this. And I think because we went into so much detail, I'm going to upload this as a standalone thing. So yeah. Awesome. Thank you again.
No worries. Cheers, guys. Thank you very much.